On June 4th, 1944, the U.S. Navy pulled off an amazing feat. They captured one of Hitler's feared U-boats.
The planes were coming in, calling us, Frenchie, how do you hear me? How do you hear me? I have sub in sight.
There was this sub on the surface of the water. Word was passed, report to the captain on the bridge immediately. He said, I want that ship.
And they were shooting at the boat. I gave the order. Everybody out of the boat, sinks the boat.
And as we were going towards the sub, we were passing German sailors that were abandoning the sub. And as we were going by, they would say, save me, comrade.
If anybody talks about this, there will be no court-martial. We'll just shoot you at sunrise.
We felt the top secret material would be booby-trapped, and we didn't know. Anything we touch might blow up.
Once aboard the U-505, American sailors would find a gold mine of German intelligence information, and that would hasten the end of the mighty U-boat empire. In June of 1940, World War II had been raging for almost a year. Hitler had just claimed another country, France. As German troops were marching into Paris, several hundred miles away in Hamburg, Germany, the keel was being laid for another of Hitler's feared killing submarines, or Unterseebooten. Though this one, the U-505, was built at the height of Germany's power, it would eventually help bring the seemingly invincible fleet to its knees. The German submarine group was led by the severe and powerful Admiral Dönitz. With the surrender of the French, Dönitz moved his base of operations to Lorient, France. Here, he had easy access to Allied shipping lanes. At Lorient, Dönitz had rows of fortified submarine pens built to house his prize boats. In those first years of World War II, the Allies were completely unprepared to deal with these lethal submarines. The U-boats patrolled the waters of the Atlantic without fear. In fact, Germany had been so successful on land and sea that the crew of the new U-505 worried that the war would be over before they could do their part. At the helm of the U-505 was Captain Lieutenant Axel Olaf Löwe. Löwe, whose name meant lion in German, was a career Navy man who quickly gained the respect of his crew.
Hat uns als Menschen angesehen, wie sich's gehört, ja,
He viewed us as human beings, as is proper, and not as someone running around that he could somehow torment. Nothing like that.
Löwe and his men now spent 4 months learning how to handle the vessel that would be their home for months at a time. It was crucial that each man know his job to perfection. His life and the life of his fellow sailors depended on it.
The crew was taught submerging, surfacing, gunning, and anti-aircraft gunning, and during that time we always spurred each other on a little, so that our submarine generally functioned and we would show good efforts. We were proud of our submarine and our crew.
You have to learn every screw, every little bit of the U-boat you have to know, so that even in the dark, you could find whatever mistakes there were and take care of them, which is very, very important.
On the submarine, there were specific U-boat tasks to learn, which caused us a great deal of annoyance, specifically climbing the conning tower up and down in order to be able to submerge quickly. The bridge guard had to be unbelievably quick. The defense crew had to be incredibly able to climb. Then in the harbor, too, we were very stiffly challenged to master these ladders up and down in a relatively short amount of time.
After completing training, the U-505 received her first combat assignment to patrol the waters off West Africa. The United States had been in the war for only 2 months when the U-505 left Lorient in February of 1942. As part of the war effort, America was shipping desperately needed food and materials to England. Without those supplies, Britain would not be able to fight off a German invasion. Hitler knew this and planned to starve England into submission. He sent his U-boats out to destroy Allied supply convoys. And the U-boats were quite successful at this task, destroying 1,600 Allied merchant ships and sending tons of precious cargo to the bottom of the ocean in the first years of the war.
This time period was known to the Germans, at least, as the happy time, or glückliche Zeit, and it was the longest sustained period of success in the German submarine campaign against Allied shipping.
In her first tours, the U-505 helped the fatherland by sinking 7 Allied ships, totaling some 40,000 tons of supplies. In 26,000 miles at sea, the sub ran only 814 submerged. In all that time, they were never attacked. Having scored many kills during their first 6 months at sea, the U-505 crew's morale was high and life on board the sub was good. Then one day, Captain Luva spotted a sailing ship on the horizon. Though the vessel, the Romar, was flying the flag of Colombia, a neutral country, Luva believed it could be a decoy. He ordered his men to battle stations.
And they fired a warning shot with their 10.5 centimeter cannon to encourage the Romar to stop so they could inquire what kind of cargo they were carrying and determine if it was friend or foe. Well, the Romar didn't acknowledge this warning shot, and so several more shots were fired, which were again ignored. He feared that this might be one of these decoy ships, so he decided to sink the boat.
Some superstitious sailors viewed sinking a masted ship as bad luck. Though the crew of the U-505 viewed it as a legitimate act of war, the fortunes of their sub would take a turn for the worse after this action. Soon after the sinking, Captain Luva came down with appendicitis and had to leave the boat. Under the next commander, the 505 would be plagued with so many problems, even death, that it would indeed seem jinxed. In the fall of 1942, the U-505 pulled out of its submarine pen in Lorient, France, with a new captain, Peter Czech, in command. The crew hoped to achieve great things under their new leader.
He was, when he came on board the sub, a figure of hope. We promised ourselves as young soldiers great success with this man. That he would actually almost bring us bad luck, we couldn't know at that point.
He was not a nice person. He was an imperious person, quite taken with himself. And, as I said, I only knew him as a petty officer, and the non-commissioned officers simply could not stand him.
A 252-foot-long U-boat packed with 60 men was no place for personality conflicts. The confined space made even simple tasks like eating and sleeping an ordeal.
The bunks were never cold, they were always warm. One got out and the next got in, because every 4 hours they had to be rotated. This bunk wasn't taken enthusiastically by anyone, because you couldn't relax in it. You had to lie only on your back. You couldn't turn over because of this thick pipe up there, you see.
We had special soap just for the seawater. It lathered up the water, the soap lathered. When you took normal soap, it just didn't lather. You didn't have to shave. We didn't shave. 5 months, no shaving. The beard was nice and long.
What really brought a crew together was undergoing their first enemy attack. For the crew of the U-505, that attack would be swift and powerful. One day, as they were running on the surface, a British airplane surprised the sub and dropped several depth charges before the sub even had a chance to submerge. The plane itself was sent out of control by the force of its own bombs and crashed into the ocean.
The fantastic thing was that we did not realize at the first moment what happened until we saw a man, not a man, but a head floating in the water, and his blonde hair was moved by the sea. It was an unforgettable thought. And then suddenly we put two and two together and realized that we had been attacked, that was clear, but that at the same time we had brought the aircraft down.
The sailors in the U-505 were badly shaken and worried that their damaged boat might not make it the 4,000 miles back to Lorient.
This disaster impressed us, of course, terribly, and I don't think there was much other talk on board on the way home than about what had happened to us, and we were received at Lorient like a lost son.
The U-505 was the most badly damaged submarine ever to make it home. Once there, the news from the repair crew was bad. It would take 6 months to fix the U-505. In that 6 months, the crew of the U-505 would watch with growing alarm as fewer and fewer U-boats returned from their missions. In fact, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was beginning to turn.
Visual confirmation that the Atlantic convoys are going through while more and more U-boats are being sunk.
Aber den Rückgang selbst haben wir gespürt.
But we sensed the decline itself, but never spoke about it, because that's how we were taught. The losses were impossible to replace. If the shipyards were completing 10 a month, then in the same month, 20 sank, never came back.
There were several reasons for the change. The United States had greatly increased production of new ships and planes, and they were equipped with better radar and anti-submarine weapons.
America, fighting a global war, calls on its shipbuilders for vessels of every type and description.
And most importantly, the Allies already knew how to decipher the German code, known as Enigma, and this enabled them to locate the position of enemy subs. Each U-boat carried a code breaker called an Enigma machine. This had 4 small wheels engraved with letters. When a dispatch arrived from German Naval Command, the signalman would check the codebook for the key on how to set the wheels. This was called the setup, and it changed every day. Though the Allies knew how Enigma worked, they didn't have the setups and couldn't decode messages word for word. But they could understand enough to get general locations of many U-boats.
One thing that the German U-boat arm was that it was gabby. They were micromanagers. They had to know where every U-boat was at any time. So they used radio considerably. The fortunate thing is the Germans never knew that their codes were broken. They always thought it was a saboteur or somebody spying.
Now that they had new ships and better intelligence information, the United States Navy put together a plan to aggressively go after the feared Unterseeboten. They formed task forces known as hunter-killer groups, made up of aircraft carriers and destroyer escorts. With aircraft carriers, the Navy could patrol parts of the Atlantic they couldn't reach with land-based planes. This combination of air and sea power proved devastating to the German fleet. In the first 6 months of 1943, the Allies destroyed 150 U-boats, almost double the number for the entire year before. When the U-505 was finally ready to return to duty in July of 1943, Captain Czech felt great pressure to perform well against the enemy. But in the next 3 months, Czech did not have much opportunity to face this enemy. In fact, the U-505 barely made it out of Lorient before having to turn back for repairs. Out of 90 days, only 20 were spent at sea.
People started thinking that is an unlucky boat, and there was, of course, considering the rules which were then in force, you couldn't say, I want to leave you 505, because that came always from higher quarters. But I don't think that the people were very happy. They had been extremely happy after the boat had finally and safely returned. But these turnbacks after the new attempts to go out, I think they ruined the mood of the crew. And of course the mood of the captain also.
War ja kein neues Boot mehr, das war ein gepflegtes Boot.
It was no longer a new submarine. It was a patchwork sub. And when we set out to attempt a deep dive, why, it dripped here, it dripped there. It got to the point that one fine day we had the Gestapo on board, and they said, "You're committing sabotage. You don't want to go out anymore." That wasn't true. We wanted to, but we can't very well set out with a broken sub. So that's the bad luck sub.
This reputation as a bad luck sub had a demoralizing effect on its captain, Peter Czech.
He became hesitant. He had lost his guts, so to say, which was perhaps understandable. He was not the man he had been when he became skipper of U-505, and that must have hurt him deeply, because he knew much was expected of him.
Finally, in October 1943, the U-505 made it to sea without incident. 14 days into their tour, the sonar man reported hearing noises close by. Czech was sure they were doomed. Minutes later, the sub shook under the impact of a nearly direct hit from a depth charge. Lights went out as other depth charges fell around them. The first officer heard a popping noise and saw Captain Czech collapse. He assumed that the captain had been knocked out. But in the dim light, the crew saw a pistol in Czech's hand and a pool of blood around his head. Their captain had killed himself, deserted them in the middle of an attack.
I was at that time still in the stern torpedo room as a torpedo mechanic, and I wasn't even aware that he had shot himself in the head, the commander. First through whispers, it came back to the stern compartment. Czech shot himself, and that was a terrifying situation for us, to lose the commander.
In the chaos, First Officer Paul Meyer took control and managed to maneuver the boat out of danger. The men buried Czech at sea. Once again, the U-505 limped back to the Lorient. To the dispirited crew, it did seem that their boat was jinxed. When their next captain, Harold Lange, stepped aboard the sub just 1 week later, he faced a shattered crew. In fact, German Naval Command had chosen him as the best man to revive the morale on the U-505.
He had commented that when he came aboard U-505, he encountered a crew that was thoroughly demoralized. And in his estimation, it took quite a bit of coaxing and retraining, but commented that it basically took 2 to 3 weeks before he saw a change in the demeanor of the crew.
As Lange was breaking in his crew, another captain, thousands of miles across the Atlantic, was taking command of a hunter-killer task group. This American officer, Daniel Gallery, would end up having an even more profound effect on the sailors of the U-505 than their own Captain Lange would. Gallery led his force of 6 ships from the small aircraft carrier, the USS Guadalcanal. As a commander, Gallery wasn't afraid to think big. He became the first one in the Atlantic to regularly send air patrols out at night. This made sense since subs surfaced then to recharge batteries. But night flying had always been thought too risky to try. Landing on the deck of a small aircraft carrier was tricky, even in daylight. Though Gallery lost a few planes in landings, he never lost a man.
When I watch the movies now, it scares me to death just watching them. The carrier landings on those little carriers, because the span of the TBM was about 54-foot span. I think the carrier was about 60 feet wide and about 500 feet long. It's pretty tricky flying to come in.
With Allied aircraft patrolling deep into the Atlantic day and night, the Germans found that instead of being the hunters, they were now the hunted.
So by keeping them underwater, that slowed them down. They could not chase a convoy. If they had found it, they would start falling behind, or they would not be able to locate a convoy because they were under the surface. So it played a heavy role in the decline of the morale of the German submariners.
The U-505's running log for this time showed the change. In one 12-day stretch, the sub spent only 60 hours on the surface and 228 underwater, hiding from the enemy. But the crew of the 505 remained optimistic about making an impact on the German war effort. Soon their wish would be fulfilled, but not in the way they expected. In the spring of 1944, Harold Lange's U-boat and Daniel Gallery's task force were each patrolling the waters off the coast of West Africa. It wouldn't be long before they would change history together. Captain Daniel Gallery had shocked his men by announcing that instead of sinking the next U-boat they encountered, they would try to capture it. The American Navy hadn't captured an enemy vessel in battle since the War of 1812. The risks were great. Everyone knew that German submarine crews booby-trapped their boats with explosives before abandoning them. Any enemy boarding party would have to work quickly to defuse those bombs or end up on the bottom of the ocean themselves. However, the payoff would also be great in knowledge gained about the enemy. Gallery's crew was willing to go along with the radical idea. They just assumed it would never happen.
Captain called us all together and laid out the plan, and he didn't specifically go into each of our jobs at that time, and we all thought he was a little bit crazy, that this was a ridiculous kind of a thing to be talking about, and we said, you know, we put this in its proper place and went on about our business. I didn't think too much about it.
Gallery ordered each of his ships to train a group of sailors who would board and secure a sub.
And I volunteered right away. And they said, why are you volunteering for something like that? I said, I'll tell you why. I said, the next time there's action, I said, I want to be on top looking. I said, I don't want to be down there listening with my headphones.
The task force searched fruitlessly for a sub for weeks. At the end of May, with fuel running low, they set a course for Casablanca to refuel. Naval intelligence had given them information about a nearby U-boat, and Gallery decided to check it out on the way. He was determined to make a capture. However, though the Americans kept hearing and seeing evidence of a sub, they couldn't find it. While Captain Gallery was busy hunting for a sub, Captain Lange on the U-505 was busy avoiding phantom enemies. Every time he surfaced to recharge the batteries, his radar detector set off a warning and he was forced under. In a way, the radar was crying wolf, picking up signals from enemies too far away to be of any danger. At this point, Gallery's task force was still 600 miles away. For the next several days, both Lange and Gallery made decisions based on faulty information. But these decisions brought them closer and closer together. On the night of June 3rd, Lange was finally able to surface for a full 4 hours to recharge batteries and give his men a breath of much-needed fresh air. Ironically, the U-505's detection system remained silent when one of Gallery's planes passed only 6 miles away. So Lange now believed that he had finally eluded the hunter-killers, and Gallery was afraid that he had lost his sub. In reality, the two were practically on top of each other. The next morning, June 4th, the sonar men on one of the destroyer escorts, the Chatelaine, heard the distinctive ping of a submarine on their sonar.
It was just a routine morning, like every other day, and suddenly at a few minutes after 11, I picked this sound contact up, and it wasn't far away either. It was about 060 degrees from the ship and about 600 to 800 yards away.
That's too close.
That's very close, and you get quite excited when it's that close, I'll tell you.
Well, we had been hunting this submarine, the U-505, for about a week. And it was a game of hide and seek, you know, as those things always are. And we got close to him several times, and he'd get away from us. And this had been going on for about a week. Well, finally, on Sunday, June 4th, just at noon, we ran right over the U-505 with our destroyers.
Well, I think I was laying on my bunk, and then the radio operator came and told me he had sticks in the telephone. And then we went slowly up to 11 meters. That's the periscope depth. I went up to the conning tower and threw the periscope out, and I saw 5 destroyers around me, a very good position, and perhaps 10 or 12 aeroplanes in the air.
The U-505 dived and then sent out decoys to throw their enemy off track. At first, they worked. The chatelaine fired at the decoy's air bubbles, thinking it was the sub. Longa and his crew were praying they could wriggle out of danger. But the chatelaine wasn't fooled for long, and within minutes, the sub suffered a direct hit. The impact threw the sailors across the sub. The lights went out, and in the darkness, someone shouted, "Rudder taken out, water breach." When Longa heard this, he knew that his boat was fatally wounded. The captain was not going to sacrifice his crew. He ordered the sub to the surface and told the men to abandon ship.
You are hit in a boat with depth charges. Everything is shaking in here. No, the electric light was out, and the deep controllers fell out, and we only can guess how deep we were. I figure about 220, 230 meters. So we blew on and came out of the water like a cork because we couldn't control it.
And the planes were coming in, and the planes were calling us, "Frenchie, how do you hear me? I have sub in sight." And then he said, "I'm going to spray the area over the submarine." So I said, "Okay, here's 5x5. Then I pulled out, opened up the tube, and I yelled to the bridge up on top side, "The airplane is going to spray the submarine."
At this point, the American sailors feared that the U-boat crew might still try to attack. The U-505 did fire a torpedo, and the destroyer returned fire, but both shots missed. Now the Americans peppered the sub with gunfire from the planes and destroyer escorts. The German sailors, however, were just trying to get off their boat alive.
And I came out of the conning tower hatch, and there I saw Gogi lying topside. Just picked him up, and I said to him, "Gogi," I said, "come on." And then I saw he was dead, shot through here. And then I was out.
When I came up, I saw a plane flying at us from starboard, but I didn't know at that point whether it would fire. I jumped sternward behind the 4-barreled gun. There came a plane again from the front. And consequently, I jumped down from the conning tower and made a headlong dive and was in the water.
The attack took all of 11 minutes. It was almost over before off-duty pilots on the Guadalcanal realized it had begun.
I said, "Hey, you guys, there's a sub out there circling." And this big Texan friend of mine says, "Oh, go soak your head, Ritzdorf." He says, "You go back to bed or something." I said, "No kidding, there's a sub out there." So after arguing for about 3 or 4 minutes, they finally decided I was serious, so they all ran out with me and watched. And the big Texan friend, he got so excited, he ran back to the ready room, and he's taking his shoes off. He's going to go overboard because that sub could have fired at any one of the ships.
Captain Gallery now sent a message throughout the 6 ships of the task force. "We are going to capture that sub. The day his men had thought would never arrive had come." The boarding party scrambled into their whaleboats and headed out to take their place in history.
You know, we cease fire on all the guns, and then they say away boarders, and then you go down and get in the whaleboat, and they drop you down in the water. It don't take long to do all that, and then across you go.
And as we were going toward the sub, we were passing the German sailors that were abandoning the sub. And as we were going by, they would say, "Save me, comrade, save me, comrade." And I remember I said, "Somebody's going to pick you up. We're not going to abandon you." I said, "We're going after the submarine."
As the boarding parties approached the sub, they had no idea what awaited them. Hatches rigged to explode at a touch, compartments flooding, or a surprise attack by a German sailor still on the boat. The boarding party from the USS Pillsbury was the first to reach the sub and face the unknown. The American sailors moved quickly through the sub, checking for booby traps. But the German crew had abandoned their sub so quickly that no one bothered to set the explosives. However, a German sailor had remembered to open the sea strainer, a valve that allowed water to rush in. This attempt to flood and sink the sub would have worked if he hadn't left the cover nearby. One of the boarding party members saved the day by securing the cover and stopping the sub from sinking.
And see, that's how they were going to scuttle that submarine, because so much water, and it was going to tilt it enough where it was going to slide down. We were told about booby traps. And I remember telling Wayne, I run my hand around this cover, because, well, I didn't know if there was a booby trap under this cover. So I says, Wayne, here goes nothing. So and I picked it up, and no explosion.
And we worked pretty fast because we didn't know for sure if they'd found that water scuttle valve. But once Lukosius said, here goes nothing, I was taking some stuff up, I felt a lot better. But still, we didn't know for sure, so we worked with a lot of haste.
The sailors in later boarding parties were still worried that the submarine might hold some dangerous surprises.
Made it to the conning tower, went down the ladder, and we were a little bit frightened because we felt that probably the top secret material would be booby trapped, and we didn't know. Anything we touch might blow up. We had an officer with us who knew something about explosives, but I don't think we really knew what to do in case we found them. But it was the kind of thing where you do what you have to do as quickly as you can and get out of there. We really thought the submarine was going to sink.
The boarding party found a mother lode of German intelligence information on the U-505. They filled 9 mail bags with 1,100 pounds of code books, maps, publications, and 2 Enigma machines. They quickly loaded the captured materials onto a whaleboat and brought them over to the Guadalcanal, still not fully aware of the incredible significance of all they had just captured. As the boarding party secured the U-boat, other crew members fished the German sailors out of the water. Amazingly, only 1 man had been killed and 1 man, Captain Longa, seriously injured. The German prisoners were now taken aboard the Guadalcanal and cleaned up.
So we hosed them down with salt water, and they appreciated that. They hadn't been above their conning tower and seen any daylight in 60 days, so they were in bad shape.
Though the Americans had captured the sub, their work was far from over. The next challenge was securing it to one of their ships. First, the destroyer escort, the Pillsbury, tried to get a tow line across to the sub. But she came too close, and suddenly her hull was ripped by the bow flippers of the sub, flooding 2 main compartments of the destroyer. The Pillsbury backed off to make repairs, and the Guadalcanal took over towing duties. Then, in the middle of the night, this tow line snapped.
And all hell broke loose then. Is what we're going to do is that sub going to sink. We circled the sub with the destroyers and the carrier, and luckily the next morning got another tow line over to it.
With the U-505 now securely tied to the aircraft carrier, Gallery had his sub. The question was, what would he do with it next? As the sun rose on the morning of June 5th, 1944, the sailors on the aircraft carrier Guadalcanal looked over the stern of the ship and saw an astounding sight. There, connected to them by a steel cable, was one of Hitler's feared U-boats, the one they had captured just the day before. Their captain, Daniel Gallery, was so busy figuring out what to do with the sub, he didn't even bother to tell naval intelligence about the top-secret material they had recovered from it. After several tries, his senior communications officer finally convinced Gallery to tell Washington about their amazing haul of code books, maps, and code machines.
Sent the message in. You know, we had this and had that and so on and so forth. And really, I don't guess the message had been dispatched over an hour before we heard back. Boom, urgent message telling us what to do and when and do it right now.
Naval intelligence was both elated and panicky over the capture of the codes and code machines. Panicky because they knew something Gallery and his men didn't know, that in 2 days, Allied forces would be swarming the beaches of Normandy. If the Germans found out about the sub's capture and changed their codes, any further European invasion would be in jeopardy. Gallery's superiors vetoed his plan to take the sub to the nearby port of Dakar. Too many spies there. Instead, they redirected him to Bermuda, a relatively secure port.
When you look at the logs, we were headed for Dakar. We were only a couple hundred miles off the African coast. But because the German embassy was there, and they would have seen that boat come in the harbor, and they wanted to keep it a secret. So here we go, we're 150-something miles from Dakar. We haul over 2,000 miles to Bermuda to keep it a secret.
Now, Washington sent out a refueling ship and a tug to tow the sub the long distance. During the 10-day trip to Bermuda, the destroyer escorts patrolled the waters around the sub, keeping all ships away from their prize. Enemy ships weren't the only security risk. Gallery now told his 3,000 men that they would have to keep their mouths shut about the greatest adventure of their lives. He let them know that there would be dire consequences for any breach in security.
Everybody on board our ship was given a letter. I still have the letter. By Captain Gallery. He said, "You must never mention this to anyone." And on the bottom line, he said, "Keep your bowels open and your mouth shut." That was the bottom line. That's Captain Gallery.
The U-505 pulled into Bermuda on June 19, 1944, looking like a mighty German submarine. However, her capture was a potent symbol of the decline of the U-boat fleet. The top-secret material had already been flown to Washington. This included not only code books and code machines, but maps that would allow naval intelligence to exactly pinpoint the location of the German subs.
We got to Washington, and they took all this stuff and put it in a panel truck and took me and the mail bags to naval intelligence. So we went back in where they were working on the codes. And the guy said, "Hallelujah, we got the setups for today." You know, boom, and they started using that stuff right now.
Whenever a U-boat reported its position back to home base, it would use this grid chart that would have letters on it saying, "I'm in location AG," or something like that, which was totally meaningless to somebody who didn't have the grid chart, which indeed was our position until the capture of the 505. Once we had that, then we could not only read the message, decipher the message that gave us the letters, but we could also look on the chart and say, aha, that's where they are.
In the 11 months remaining in the war, the Allies sank nearly 300 U-boats. But the U-505 proved valuable far beyond code breaking. Now that the Navy had their hands on a German submarine, they could study their enemy up close. And on board the U-505 was Germany's latest killing technology, the T-5 acoustic torpedo.
This torpedo was capable of homing in on the sounds of screws, the turning screws on the ships. And so by capturing a T-5 torpedo intact aboard U-505, the Allies were able to develop countermeasures that really made the acoustic homing torpedo almost useless.
It was a treasure trove of information, and especially of looking at what a German U-boat actually was like, what it was made of, how it was constructed. It was turned into a tame submarine for the rest of the war, renamed Nemo, and used as a training aid for anti-submarine forces to train against an actual German submarine.
Once the war was over, the U-505 itself would sit in a shipyard in New Hampshire. It would take the effort of the captain who had captured it to once again save the German sub from ending up at the bottom of the ocean. Though World War II had ended in 1945, the U-505 still faced a battle in peacetime. After the war, the submarine was taken to the Navy Yard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There she remained, neglected, until 1948, when the Navy decided to destroy her. Once again, Daniel Gallery fought to keep the boat from sinking.
And he pointed out, this is not one that was just surrendered. This is one that was captured on the high seas in combat, and in fact was the first enemy vessel captured by the U.S. Navy in combat since the War of 1812. He then made efforts to have it set up somewhere as a monument to people who had perished in the Atlantic in World War II, and as a sort of monument to the U.S. Navy at large.
The Museum of Science and Industry in Gallery's hometown of Chicago was anxious to give the submarine a home, but it took several years of fundraising to make that happen. Finally, in May of 1954, the U-505 headed out on her last voyage. She looped around Canada, came through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and down to Chicago. There, the city greeted the sub with great fanfare. The U-505 had to make the last part of its journey to the museum over land. 15,000 people watched as the sub crawled across the outer drive at 8 inches a minute. Once in place, the U-505 was dedicated as a memorial to all U.S. sailors lost at sea during the 2 World Wars. "20 years after the capture, in 1964, the 2 captains met once again on the submarine that changed their lives.
Well, a lot of things have happened in the past 20 years, and the fact that Captain Lang is here today and that we're good friends, I think, is very significant. And it shows that in 20 years, well, in the past 20 years, nations as well as men who were enemies have now become friends. But this type of submarine almost drove us off the face of the seas 20 years ago.
Of course, seeing the boat and entering the boat again, that's some feeling already. But I think the time healed a lot, and I have no bad feelings at all. But of course, well, how to express it's pretty hard. On the one hand, you are glad you got off all that business, and on the other hand, you are reminded on it again.
Over the years, both the American and German veterans of the U-505 have visited the submarine at the museum and have come face to face with their history.
When I return to the torpedo room in which I did my work earlier, then I get shivers down my spine somehow, for I see my workspace here in manifold form. I mean, all the torpedoes in different places, so I can immediately recall what kind of work we had to do.
First time I saw it in the museum, it was a kind of a feeling of achievement, that what happened, how it got here, and what we were responsible for it, to get it here. And it brought back memories of that long day and what happened then.
In fact, I told one of the Germans we were talking the other day, I told him, I said, there's no winners or losers here. I said, just survivors.
In the end, the greatest survivor of the battle for the U-505 is the bad luck sub herself. She outlasted her sister ships and ended up, of all places, on land in the middle of America.
They carry half the world's arsenal, and they are invisible.
Trying to track submarines in the Atlantic Ocean is a preposterous engineering challenge.
Extreme Machines, Nuclear Subs, part of Subweek, coming up next on the Military Channel.